Picture this. New York City, September 7th, 1875. A cramped apartment on Irving Place in Manhattan. The air is thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of too many bodies pressed into too small a space. 30 people are gathered in a circle, sitting on mismatched chairs and cushions, their faces lit by flickering candles. Outside, the city rattles and hums with the noise of the Gilded Age. Horses, carriages, street vendors, the clash of industry and immigration. But in this room, everyone is silent, waiting. At the center of the circle sits a woman. She is massive, nearly 300 pounds, her body straining against a loose-fitting dress that looks more like a peasant's smock than anything fashionable. Her face is broad, plain, decidedly unfeminine by the standards of Victorian beauty. Her hair is pulled back carelessly. She wears no jewelry, no makeup, nothing to soften her appearance but her eyes. People always mention her eyes. Blue-gray, piercing, magnetic. Eyes that seem to see through you. Eyes that make you believe, even when your rational mind is screaming that what you're witnessing is impossible. She's smoking, rolling her own cigarette with thick, practiced fingers while the circle waits, takes a long drag, exhales a cloud of smoke that drifts through the candlelight like a spirit itself. "Are we ready?" she asks, in a voice that carries the trace of a Russian accent, rough and commanding. The circle murmurs assent. She closes her eyes. Her breathing slows. The room seems to contract around her, as if reality itself is bending toward this woman, this moment. And then it begins. A sound, faint at first, a rhythmic knocking, like someone rapping on wood. But there's no one near the walls, no one near the furniture. The sound seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. Rap. 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 The candles flicker though there's no breeze. Someone gasps. A letter, an actual physical letter, materializes from thin air and flutters down onto the table. Just appears. One moment there's empty space, the next there's paper, falling gently like a leaf. A man rushes forward, grabs it. His hands are shaking. He breaks the seal, which is somehow already intact, already marked with a strange symbol, and reads. His face goes white. "This is," he whispers. "This is my mother's handwriting. But she's been dead for 3 years." The woman at the center, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, though everyone calls her HPB, opens her eyes and smiles. Not a gentle smile, a knowing smile. The smile of someone who has access to secrets you can't even imagine. "The masters send their greetings," she says, and takes another drag of her cigarette. This is how it started. This is how a Russian aristocrat turned wandering mystic, turned New York, medium invented the modern New Age movement. How she created the blueprint for every spiritual teaching, every yoga retreat, every crystal healing session, every manifestation workshop you've ever encountered. Everything from chakras to karma to finding your authentic self passes through this woman. This chain-smoking, swearing, obese, brilliant, outrageous, possibly fraudulent, definitely complicated woman. She claimed to have studied with hidden masters in Tibetan caves, to channel ancient wisdom from beings who existed beyond normal reality, to have discovered the secret spiritual history of humanity, spanning millions of years and lost continents. She was almost certainly a fraud. The evidence is overwhelming, and yet, her influence is so vast, so pervasive, that you're living in a world she shaped whether you know her name or not. Every time someone talks about their higher self, or spiritual journey, or universal consciousness, they're speaking a language Helena Blavatsky invented. Was she the greatest con artist in religious history? Or a genuine mystic who used deception to communicate truths that couldn't be spoken directly? The answer might be both simultaneously, impossibly. Because the real mystery of Madame Blavatsky isn't whether her phenomena were real. It's how a woman with no credentials, no institutional support, no money, and a past she refused to explain, managed to create a religion that's still growing, still evolving, still shaping how millions of people understand spirituality. Before we descend into the smoke and mirrors of Blavatsky's world, I want to ask something of you. If you believe these strange corners of history deserve examination and honest exploration, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Archives. Your support allows us to continue illuminating the mysteries of the past. Tonight, we journey from the aristocratic estates of Imperial Russia to the séance parlors of New York, from a scandalous escape and mysterious lost years to the birth of a movement that changed Western spirituality forever. From miraculous phenomena to devastating exposures, from devoted disciples to accusations of fraud, from a deathbed in London to a legacy that reaches into your life today, whether you know it or not. This is the story of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Madame Blavatsky, HPB, the woman who invented modern mysticism, the fraud who told the truth, the charlatan who changed the world. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Yekaterinoslav, Ukraine, July 31st, 1831. Helena von Hahn is born into exactly the kind of family that should guarantee a comfortable, conventional life. Her father, Pyotr von Hahn, is a minor aristocrat serving in the Russian Imperial Army, a captain of artillery, descended from German nobility that settled in Russia generations ago. Her mother, Helena Andreevna, comes from the prestigious Fadeev family, old Russian aristocracy with connections to the court. This is privilege, real privilege. Not wealth exactly. The von Hahns aren't rich by aristocratic standards, but position, education, access to society. Helena grows up in estates and military outposts, surrounded by servants, tutors, the entire apparatus of the Russian upper class. She should have had a normal life, marriage to an appropriate match, children, social obligations. The quiet, circumscribed existence of a woman of her class in Imperial Russia. But from the very beginning, something was wrong with Helena, or right with her, depending on your perspective. She saw things. Her family would later recall that as a child, Helena claimed to see people who weren't there. Figures in old-fashioned clothing walking through rooms, faces in mirrors that didn't match the people standing before them, lights that had no source. She talked to these entities, had full conversations with empty air. Her family was disturbed. This wasn't normal childhood imagination. This was something else, something that, in the superstitious world of 19th century Russia, suggested either madness or demonic influence. They called in doctors, priests. The doctors prescribed various remedies, bleedings, cold baths, the crude psychiatric interventions of the era. The priests performed prayers, suggested the child might be possessed. Nothing changed. Helena continued to see her spirits, continued to live partially in a world no one else could perceive. But she wasn't just strange. She was also willful, rebellious, ungovernable. She refused to behave like a proper aristocratic girl. She rode horses astride instead of side saddle, shocking the servants. She climbed trees, tore her dresses, swore using language she'd picked up from soldiers. She read voraciously, philosophy, occult texts, anything she could get her hands on that hinted at realities beyond the mundane. Her mother died when Helena was 11. Her grandmother, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, took over her upbringing and was appalled by the wild child she'd inherited. The grandmother decided that what Helena needed was marriage. A husband would settle her, give her purpose, transform her from this strange, volatile girl into a proper woman. It was 1848. Helena was 17 years old, and the man her family chose for her was Nikifor Blavatsky. Nikifor Vladimirovich Blavatsky was vice-governor of Yerevan province in Armenia. He was respectable, established, well-connected. He was also in his 40s, more than twice Helena's age. The marriage was arranged quickly. Helena apparently agreed, not because she wanted to marry this man, but because she saw it as an escape from her grandmother's control. She thought marriage meant freedom. She was wrong. The wedding took place in July 1848. It was a traditional Orthodox ceremony, formal and binding. Helena stood in her wedding dress, went through the rituals, spoke the vows. And on the wedding night, when Nikifor attempted to consummate the marriage, Helena refused. According to the accounts that would later surface, she told him that she'd only married him to escape her family, that she had no intention of being a wife in any real sense, and that if he tried to force the issue, she would make his life a living hell. Nikifor, shocked and humiliated, apparently tried to assert his legal rights as a husband. Helena responded by locking herself in her room and threatening to kill herself if he came near her. The marriage was a disaster from day one. For 3 months, they lived in this state of Cold War. Helena refusing to fulfill any wifely duties, Nikifor growing increasingly angry and frustrated, both of them trapped in a situation that satisfied neither. And then, one morning in September 1848, Nikifor woke up to find Helena gone. She'd fled in the night, taking almost nothing with her, just vanished. For a young aristocratic woman in 1848 to abandon her husband was scandalous beyond measure. It wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was essentially illegal. A wife was her husband's property under Russian law. She had no legal right to leave, no right to independent existence. But Helena didn't care about legality or scandal. She was free, and she had absolutely no intention of ever going back. Here's where Helena Blavatsky's story becomes impossible to verify. For the next decade, from 1848 to 1858, her whereabouts are almost completely undocumented. She would later claim an extraordinary odyssey, travels that would have been nearly impossible for a woman alone in that era. She said she went first to Constantinople, then to Egypt, that she studied with Coptic magicians in Cairo, learning ancient Egyptian mysteries, that she traveled through Greece, exploring the ruins of ancient temples, then further east, through Palestine, Syria, into Persia, learning from Druze mystics, Sufi masters, practitioners of traditions that Europeans barely knew existed. And then, and this is the claim that would become central to her later teachings, She said she traveled to India and Tibet, that in Tibet she met the masters, the Mahatmas, enlightened beings who had transcended normal human limitations and existed in a state of advanced spiritual evolution. That they accepted her as a student, brought her to hidden monasteries in the Himalayas, taught her the secret wisdom that governed the universe, the laws of karma and reincarnation, the history of human spiritual evolution, the techniques for accessing higher consciousness, that she spent years in these caves and monasteries, being initiated into mysteries that hadn't been shared with Westerners in thousands of years. It's a magnificent story, epic, romantic, the kind of spiritual autobiography that would inspire millions. There's just one problem. There's almost no evidence any of it happened. No passport records showing she traveled to Tibet. No witnesses who can confirm seeing her in the Himalayas. No documentation of her presence in these remote regions. The few verifiable facts we have from this period suggest something very different. She was seen in London in the early 1850s, working as a medium in spiritualist circles. She may have spent time in Paris. There are hints she traveled with a circus for a while, perhaps as a fortune teller or performer. Some historians believe she was working as a sex worker in some of these cities. Others think she was simply moving through Europe's underground occult scene, learning stage magic, studying with spiritualists and mediums, absorbing techniques for producing phenomena. What's certain is that she was poor, desperate even, living hand to mouth, far from her aristocratic upbringing, completely cut off from family support. And at some point during these years, she began to develop the persona that would make her famous, the mysterious wanderer who had studied with Eastern masters, the initiate into secret wisdom, the woman who had seen things no European woman had ever seen. Whether this persona was based on real experiences or complete fabrication is one of the great unanswered questions of her life. What we know for certain is that when Helena Blavatsky re-emerged in the late 1850s, she was transformed. The wild, rebellious, aristocratic girl was gone. In her place was someone else, someone who carried herself with absolute confidence, who spoke with authority about subjects that were barely understood in the West. She had gained enormous weight. The slender teenager had become a large woman, deliberately presenting herself in a way that defied Victorian beauty standards. She dressed like a peasant despite her aristocratic background. She chain-smoked constantly, rolling her own cigarettes, and she had abilities, or appeared to have abilities. She would later claim that the phenomena, the rappings, the materializations, the apparent communication with spirits or higher beings began spontaneously during her travels, that she didn't seek them out, they found her. But to observers who encountered her in the spiritualist circles of Europe in the late 1850s, it looked much more deliberate. It looked like a woman who had studied the techniques of stage magic and spiritualist deception and had become very, very good at them. She appeared in Cairo in 1871, attempting to establish a spiritualist society called the Société Spirit. It failed quickly. The European community there found her too strange, too theatrical, too obviously performing. So she moved on, through Eastern Europe, through Russia briefly, but carefully avoiding areas where her husband might find her, through France and England. And in 1873, following some instinct or calculation, she boarded a ship to America. She arrived in New York with almost no money, knowing no one, speaking English with a thick Russian accent. Within 2 years, she would be the most famous medium in America. Within 5, she would found a movement that would reshape Western spirituality for the next century and a half. Before we follow her to America, there's one significant episode from this period that deserves attention. In 1858, after a decade of wandering, Helena briefly returned to Russia, not to her husband. She carefully avoided him, but to her family's estates. Her relatives were shocked by her appearance. The slender girl had become a large woman, the refined aristocrat dressed like a peasant, and she smoked constantly, something no respectable woman would do in public. But what truly disturbed them was how she'd changed internally. She spoke with absolute certainty about realities that sounded insane, about masters in Tibet who communicated telepathically, about the spiritual evolution of humanity, about past lives and karma and reincarnation, concepts that had barely penetrated European consciousness at that point. She demonstrated phenomena. Objects would move in her presence. Rapping sounds would follow her through the house. She would produce letters and flowers that seemed to appear from nowhere. Her family was split. Some thought she'd found genuine spiritual truth. Others were convinced she'd gone mad during her travels, or that she was deliberately perpetrating fraud for attention. One cousin, Count Sergei Witt, who would later become Prime Minister of Russia, wrote about her years later. She was undoubtedly a remarkable woman. Whether she was a great mystic or a great charlatan, I could never decide. Possibly both. Helena stayed in Russia for about a year, then left again. The conventional life her family offered, even with their newfound willingness to accept her eccentricities, was unbearable to her. She needed to be in motion, needed to be discovering, performing, teaching, needed an audience that would accept her claims rather than treating them with aristocratic skepticism. She needed America because America in the 1870s was in the grip of a spiritual revolution, and it was hungry for exactly what Helena Blavatsky had to offer. To understand Helena Blavatsky's success in America, you have to understand the madness that was American spiritualism in the 1870s. It had started in 1848, the same year Helena married and fled Nikifor, in a small house in Hydesville, New York. 2 young sisters, Kate and Margaretta Fox, claimed to be receiving messages from a spirit through mysterious knocking sounds. The Rochester rappings became a sensation. Within months, spiritualism, the belief that the dead could communicate with the living through mediums, exploded across America. Why? Because America was traumatized. The Civil War had killed over 600,000 men. Nearly every family had lost someone, a father, son, brother, husband. The grief was overwhelming, and traditional Christianity's vague promises about heaven felt inadequate. People desperately wanted to know that their dead loved ones still existed somewhere, somehow. That death wasn't just obliteration, but transition. That communication was possible. Mediums offered that hope, and America embraced them with an almost religious fervor. By the 1870s, there were thousands of practicing mediums across the country. Séances were held in homes, theaters, rented halls. Spiritualist churches sprouted up in major cities. Newspapers devoted serious coverage to debates about whether the phenomena were real. Most mediums were obvious frauds. They used tricks borrowed from stage magicians, hidden assistants, mechanical devices, luminous paint in dark rooms. The more sophisticated ones used techniques like cold reading to gather information from sitters, and make it seem like spirits were providing specific details, but people wanted to believe, needed to believe. So they overlooked the obvious deceptions, or convinced themselves that even if some mediums were frauds, surely the phenomena themselves were real. Into this fevered, credulous, desperate landscape walked Helena Blavatsky in 1873. She was 42 years old, overweight, shabby, chain-smoking, speaking broken English. She had no money, no connections, no prospects. But she had something none of the other mediums had: genuine charisma, vast knowledge of obscure philosophy, and phenomena that were genuinely impressive. Within months, she was the talk of New York's spiritualist circles. What made Blavatsky stand out from the crowd of mediums wasn't just that she produced phenomena, it was the nature of what she produced. Most mediums in America focused on the dead. They channeled specific spirits: your dead uncle, your departed child, your late husband. They passed along messages, usually vague and sentimental. Blavatsky barely bothered with that. She wasn't interested in dead people's gossip. Instead, she claimed to be in contact with living masters, highly evolved beings who existed in Tibet and other remote locations, who had transcended normal human limitations, who were guiding human evolution and occasionally chose to communicate with those who were ready. Her phenomena reflected this different focus. The rappings that followed her weren't just yes-no communications. They were complex, rhythmic, seemingly intelligent witnesses, described patterns that felt musical, even beautiful. Objects didn't just move in her presence, they teleported. Materializations she called apports. A flower would appear on an empty table. A letter would fall from the ceiling. Small objects would manifest in locked rooms. But the most impressive phenomena were the letters themselves. These weren't messages from dead relatives. These were letters allegedly written by the Mahatmas, particularly two she named Kut Humi and Moria. They would appear in impossible locations, sealed inside envelopes that had never been opened, inside locked drawers, falling from empty air. They were written on distinctive paper, thick, cream-colored, with a texture unlike anything available in New York. The handwriting was beautiful, calligraphic, Eastern in style, and the content wasn't sentimental messages, but dense philosophical teachings about karma, reincarnation, spiritual evolution. Witnesses were baffled. How was she doing this? Some attempted to catch her in the act. They'd search her before séances, making sure she had nothing hidden on her person. They'd examine the rooms, looking for trapdoors or hidden compartments. They'd watch her hands constantly, and still, the phenomena occurred. A journalist named Henry Olcott was assigned to investigate her and expose the fraud. He was a Civil War veteran, a lawyer, a skeptic. Exactly the kind of hard-headed man who should have seen through any deception. Instead, he became her most devoted disciple. Henry Steele Olcott was everything Blavatsky wasn't. He was American, conventional, respectable, a successful lawyer and journalist, a family man, married, with children, rational, organized, methodical. But he was also searching. The war had shaken his faith in conventional Christianity. He'd seen too much death, too much suffering, too much randomness for the simple narratives of sin and salvation to satisfy him. He had become interested in spiritualism as a phenomenon worth investigating, not necessarily as a believer, but as a journalist documenting an interesting social movement. In September 1874, He attended a séance at the Eddy farmhouse in Vermont, where Blavatsky was present. He watched her produce phenomena that he couldn't explain, and more importantly, he talked with her afterward. Blavatsky didn't perform the deferential femininity that Victorian society expected. She argued with him, challenged his assumptions, demonstrated knowledge of philosophy and Eastern religion that was genuinely impressive. She told him about the masters, about the ancient wisdom that existed before all modern religions, about the spiritual science that could reconcile faith and reason. Occult was hooked. Within weeks, he'd moved his family to New York to be closer to her. Within months, he'd essentially abandoned his conventional life to become her partner in creating something unprecedented. Years later, he would write, "I felt from the first that I was in the presence of someone extraordinary, whether prophet or charlatan I couldn't yet say, but extraordinary, undoubtedly." He would spend the rest of his life, over 30 years, working alongside Blavatsky, defending her against critics, organizing her teachings, managing the practical aspects of the movement they would create together. Was there a romantic relationship? Possibly, early on. Blavatsky would later claim lifelong celibacy, but in the 1870s, there were hints of intimacy between them. Whatever the nature of their relationship, it was profound, the partnership that would birth Theosophy. On November 17th, 1875, in Blavatsky's apartment on West 47th Street in New York, a group of about 20 people gathered for a meeting that would change the course of Western spirituality. They were a diverse group: lawyers, doctors, spiritualists, journalists, society ladies, seekers of various kinds. What they had in common was dissatisfaction with both conventional Christianity and the trivial nature of most spiritualist phenomena. They wanted something deeper, more philosophical, more connected to ancient wisdom. Occult stood and proposed the formation of a society dedicated to investigating the hidden laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. A society that would study comparative religion, philosophy, and science. That would explore everything from ancient texts to modern phenomena. They would call it the Theosophical Society. From the Greek, theos, God, and Sophia, wisdom, divine wisdom. Occult was named President Blavatsky, officially was merely corresponding secretary. But everyone in that room knew who was really the source of the teachings. The society's stated objectives were deliberately broad. First, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. Second, to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. Third, to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man. Noble goals. But what the Theosophical Society really represented was Blavatsky's vision, a synthesis of Eastern and Western mysticism, a scientific approach to spirituality, and most importantly, the idea that ancient masters possessed knowledge that modern humanity had forgotten. The Mahatmas weren't just wise teachers in Blavatsky's cosmology. They were guardians of truths that predated all modern religions, and she was their chosen messenger to the West. The phenomenon that truly established Blavatsky's authority and would eventually contribute to her downfall was the Mahatma letters. Starting in 1875 and continuing through the 1880s, letters allegedly written by the masters Kuthumi and Maurya would appear in extraordinary circumstances, a typical scenario. A member of the Theosophical Society would be struggling with a spiritual or philosophical question. They might mention it to Blavatsky, or sometimes they'd just be thinking about it. And then, impossibly, an answer would arrive. A letter would materialize in a shrine that Blavatsky kept in her apartment, a wooden cabinet where she said objects could be transmitted from the masters. The letter would address the exact question the person had been pondering, often going into elaborate philosophical detail. Or a letter would simply fall from the ceiling during a gathering, would appear inside a cushion that had been sewn shut, would manifest in a locked drawer that no one had opened. The letters themselves were impressive artifacts, written on distinctive paper that members couldn't find anywhere in New York. In beautiful, flowing script that looked nothing like Western handwriting, containing sophisticated discussions of karma, reincarnation, cosmic evolution, the relationship between matter and consciousness. The teachings in these letters would form the core of Theosophical doctrine. They described a universe governed by spiritual laws, as precise as physical laws. They outlined the evolution of humanity through root races, stages of spiritual development spanning millions of years. They referenced lost continents like Atlantis and Lemuria, where advanced civilizations had once flourished. And they positioned the Mahatmas as guardians of this knowledge, occasionally choosing worthy individuals to receive it. For Theosophists, these letters were proof. Physical, tangible proof that Blavatsky was who she claimed to be, a student of enlightened beings, chosen to bring ancient wisdom to the modern world. For skeptics, they were obvious frauds. The handwriting, when analyzed, looked suspiciously similar to Blavatsky's own. The paper, while exotic, could have been acquired through import shops. The content, while impressive, drew heavily from Eastern texts that were starting to be translated into English. But here's the thing, even if the letters were fake, producing them required genuine skill. You had to know the philosophy well enough to write convincing teachings. You had to create the physical objects convincingly. You had to stage their appearance in ways that baffled observers. If Blavatsky was faking the Mahatma letters, she was a remarkably talented faker. In 1877, Blavatsky published her first major book, Isis Unveiled, a master key to the mysteries of ancient and modern science and theology. It was enormous, 2 volumes, nearly 1,400 pages, dense, rambling, erudite, infuriating, brilliant, probably plagiarized in parts, definitely original in others. The book attempted nothing less than a complete reinterpretation of human history, science, and religion. Blavatsky argued that all religions contained fragments of an ancient wisdom, that science was rediscovering truths that mystics had known for millennia, that the universe was far stranger, far more magical than materialist science admitted. She quoted extensively from obscure texts, Hindu scriptures, Buddhist sutras, Hermetic traditions, Kabbalistic writings, Gnostic gospels. She referenced ancient Egypt, Babylon, Greece, Tibet, India. She discussed everything from magnetism to spiritualism to the nature of consciousness. Critics pointed out numerous errors, questionable citations, and passages that seemed lifted from other sources. One reviewer called it a large dish of hash. But for readers hungry for an alternative to both Christian orthodoxy and materialist science, Isis Unveiled was revelation. Here was someone claiming that the mysteries weren't lost, that ancient wisdom was accessible, that spiritual reality was as real as physical reality. The book sold remarkably well, multiple printings in the first year. It established Blavatsky as not just a medium producing phenomena, but a genuine scholar and mystic philosopher. Of course, much of the scholarship was questionable. Blavatsky had a habit of citing sources that didn't exist, or misrepresenting sources that did. But she wove it all together with such confidence, such sweeping vision, that believers were convinced she was accessing genuine hidden knowledge. Writing the book nearly killed her. She claimed that the Mahatmas helped her, feeding her information telepathically. Guiding her research, skeptics noted that she had access to the Astor Library in New York and probably spent months there copying passages from obscure texts. Either way, ISIS Unveiled established Helena Blavatsky as the leading voice of a new spiritual movement, one that promised ancient wisdom, scientific spirituality, and human evolution toward godhood. The Theosophical Society was growing. Branches were forming in other cities. Curious seekers were flocking to New York to meet Madame Blavatsky. But New York, ultimately, wasn't the right location for what she was building. Her teachings claimed to draw from the East, from India and Tibet. To be truly credible, she needed to be closer to the source. In December 1878, Blavatsky and Occult boarded a ship bound for India. They would never live in America again. And in India, both the triumphs and disasters of Blavatsky's career would reach their peak. When Helena Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott arrived in Bombay in February 1879, they were greeted as heroes. The idea that white Westerners, and prominent ones at that, had come to India specifically to study its spiritual traditions was almost unprecedented. For decades, British colonialism had positioned itself as bringing civilization and Christianity to the backward East. Western scholars studied Indian texts, yes, but usually to understand a dead past, not to learn living wisdom. Blavatsky was doing something different. She was claiming that India possessed spiritual knowledge superior to anything the West had produced, that the Vedas and Upanishads contained truths that Western science was only beginning to glimpse, that yoga and meditation offered paths to enlightenment that Christianity couldn't match. For educated Indians struggling under British colonial rule, this was extraordinarily validating. Here were Westerners taking them seriously as spiritual authorities, not just colonial subjects. The Theosophical Society found fertile ground in India. Branches opened in major cities. Wealthy Indians and progressive Hindus joined. Buddhist leaders in Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, welcomed Olcott and Blavatsky, seeing them as allies in preserving Buddhist teachings against Christian missionary pressure. In 1882, they established permanent headquarters in Adyar, near Madras, modern Chennai, a large compound with buildings for the society's work, living quarters, a library, and most importantly, a shrine room. This shrine room would become central to Blavatsky's phenomena and eventually to her exposure. It was a wooden cabinet built into the wall of Blavatsky's quarters. It had two compartments, one that could be accessed from inside Blavatsky's room, one that opened into the shrine room where members would gather. Blavatsky claimed that the Mahatmas could materialize objects in this shrine, that letters, flowers, small gifts would appear there, transmitted through occult means from Tibet. Members would gather in the shrine room. Blavatsky would be in her adjacent quarters. Someone would open the shrine cabinet, and there would be a letter that hadn't been there moments before, or a brooch that a member had been hoping for, or a flower from a species that didn't grow in India. The phenomena were impressive, and they happened regularly enough that members became convinced this was genuine, supernatural manifestation. But some people were noticing details. How the timing of the appearances always required Blavatsky's presence. How she was always nearby, though technically in a different room. How she discouraged too close examination of the shrine's construction. Still, for most Theosophists, the evidence seemed overwhelming. The society was growing. The teachings were profound. Madame Blavatsky was clearly connected to something extraordinary. And then she made a critical mistake. She trusted the wrong people. Emma and Alexis Coulomb were a French couple living in Ceylon when they met Blavatsky in 1880. They were down on their luck, poor, looking for employment, willing to do anything. Blavatsky, characteristically generous with people she liked, took them in. She hired them as caretakers for the Adyar headquarters. Emma Coulomb would manage the household. Alexis would handle maintenance and construction. The Coulombs were loyal initially. They worked hard. They defended Blavatsky against skeptics. They seemed devoted to the theosophical cause, but they were also seeing things that didn't quite add up. Because Alexis Coulomb, as the person maintaining the buildings, had constructed the shrine, he knew its secrets. He'd built hidden panels and sliding doors at Blavatsky's instruction, trap doors that allowed access from her quarters into the shrine cabinet, mechanisms that could produce sounds or make objects appear to materialize. At the time, he'd believed these were necessary tools for the masters to work through, that Blavatsky wasn't faking the phenomena, but rather creating conditions for genuine spiritual manifestations. But gradually, as he watched her use these mechanisms, as he saw her write letters in the master's handwriting, as he realized that every miracle had a mundane explanation, doubt crept in. By 1884, the Coulombs' relationship with Blavatsky had soured. There are conflicting accounts of why. Blavatsky claimed they were stealing from the society, and she confronted them. The Coulombs claimed they'd questioned some of her practices, and she turned on them. Whatever the cause, in May 1884, Blavatsky fired them both and ordered them off the Adyar premises. Emma Coulomb's response was devastating. She went to Christian missionaries in Madras, people who had long opposed the Theosophical Society as a threat to their conversion efforts. And she brought evidence letters in Blavatsky's handwriting, giving Emma instructions on how to produce phenomena, how to manipulate the shrine, when to drop certain objects, how to create the appearance of supernatural events. And she offered to show them the shrine itself, the hidden panels, the sliding doors, the mechanisms behind the miracles. The missionaries were gleeful. They published everything in their magazine, the Madras Christian College magazine. The letters, which seemed to prove premeditated fraud diagrams of the shrine showing its hidden compartments. Testimony from Emma about how Blavatsky had orchestrated deceptions. The scandal was immediate, and international newspapers around the world picked up the story. Famous mystic exposed as fraud. Theosophical miracles revealed as tricks. Madame Blavatsky's secret compartments. Blavatsky, who was traveling in Europe when the scandal broke, was absolutely shocked. She declared the letters forgeries. She claimed the Coulombs were lying. She said they'd altered the shrine after she'd left to make it look like she'd been faking phenomena. But the damage was done. The Society for Psychical Research in London, a respected scientific organization that investigated paranormal claims, decided to launch a full investigation. They sent their most thorough investigator, Richard Hodgson. Richard Hodgson arrived in India in December 1884 with an open mind. He was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, which included genuine scientists and scholars. They wanted to find real paranormal phenomena if it existed, but they also wanted to expose fraud where they found it. Hodgson spent weeks at Adyar. He examined the shrine thoroughly, interviewed witnesses, studied the Mahatma letters, analyzed Blavatsky's handwriting compared to the master's writings, talked to the Coulombs and to loyal Theosophists. His investigation was meticulous, and his conclusions, published in December 1885, were devastating. The shrine, Hodgson reported, was designed for trickery. He found cracks in the back panel that could be opened from Blavatsky's room, marks suggesting objects had been pushed through from behind, evidence that the cabinet had been specifically constructed to allow secret access. The Mahatma letters, after careful handwriting analysis, appeared to be written by Blavatsky herself. The handwriting experts he consulted found too many similarities. Specific letter formations, spacing patterns, even unconscious quirks that matched Blavatsky's own writing. Some of the letters, when compared to Blavatsky's personal correspondence, showed almost identical phrasing, same unusual word choices, same grammatical constructions. The rare paper the letters were written on, Hodgson found it for sale in shops in India and England. Witness testimony from people who'd seen letters appear was compromised. Most had seen the results, a letter in the shrine, but not the actual moment of appearance. And those few who claimed to have seen letters materialize from thin air were devoted Theosophists, whose testimony Hodgson found unreliable. His final verdict was brutal. For our own part, we regard her neither as the mouthpiece of hidden seers, nor as a mere vulgar adventuress. We think that she has achieved a title to permanent remembrance as one of the most accomplished, ingenious, and interesting impostors in history. The report destroyed Blavatsky's reputation among skeptics and mainstream society. Newspapers that had once covered the Theosophical Society with respectful curiosity now mocked it as a cult built on transparent fraud. But here's the strange thing. It didn't destroy the Theosophical Society itself. Many members left, certainly. The society was rocked, but a core group remained absolutely loyal. They rejected the Hodgson report as biased, claimed he'd been prejudiced against Blavatsky from the start, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and Blavatsky herself. She was devastated emotionally, but she didn't collapse, didn't give up, didn't admit fraud. Instead, she doubled down and she began work on what would be her magnum opus, the book that would secure her legacy regardless of the scandal, The Secret Doctrine. Between 1885 and 1888, while in exile from India, while her health was failing, while newspapers mocked her as an exposed fraud, Helena Blavatsky wrote The Secret Doctrine. It's enormous. 2 volumes initially, 2 volumes later expanded, nearly 1,500 pages of dense philosophical and cosmological speculation. She claimed she was translating from ancient texts, the stanzas of Jian, supposedly written in an ancient language called Senzar, preserved in hidden monasteries in Tibet. No one has ever found these texts. No scholar of Tibetan language or history recognizes Senzar. The stanzas almost certainly don't exist. And yet, The Secret Doctrine presents a cosmology so vast, so detailed, so internally consistent, that it feels like it must be drawing from something. Whether that something is genuine ancient wisdom Blavatsky's brilliant synthesis of existing sources or pure creative imagination is almost beside the point. The book describes the evolution of the cosmos in 7 stages, the development of humanity through 7 root races, each spanning millions of years. It discusses lost continents, Lemuria in the Indian Ocean, Atlantis in the Atlantic, where advanced civilizations developed and then destroyed themselves. It presents karma and reincarnation, not as religious concepts, but as scientific laws. It describes the human being as composed of 7 principles or bodies, from the physical to the divine. It outlines a path of spiritual evolution that takes lifetimes to traverse, but leads ultimately to the same enlightened state the masters have achieved. And it does all this while referencing Hindu texts, Buddhist scriptures, Hermetic traditions, Gnostic writings, ancient Egyptian wisdom, Greek philosophy, and modern science. Is it accurate scholarship? Absolutely not. Blavatsky quotes sources that don't exist, misrepresents sources that do, and invents citations when convenient. But is it influential? Profoundly so. The Secret Doctrine became the foundational text of modern Western occultism. Every New Age concept you've encountered, ascended masters, ancient aliens, Atlantean civilization, the Age of Aquarius, spiritual evolution, dimensional consciousness, every single one passes through this book. Blavatsky essentially invented the vocabulary and conceptual framework for how Westerners think about alternative spirituality. Let's step back and assess what Helena Blavatsky actually accomplished, regardless of whether her phenomena were genuine. Before Blavatsky, if you were a Westerner interested in Eastern spirituality, your options were limited. You could read the few existing translations of Hindu and Buddhist texts, but they were academic, dry, difficult to apply to your own life. Christian missionaries presented Eastern religions as primitive superstitions that needed to be overcome by Christianity's truth. Western Orientalists studied Eastern texts as historical curiosities, interesting for understanding dead civilizations, but not as living wisdom relevant to modern people. Blavatsky changed all that. She claimed, audaciously, that Eastern spiritual traditions weren't primitive, but advanced. That yoga, meditation, karma, and reincarnation weren't superstitions, but sophisticated understandings of consciousness and reality. More than that, she argued that all religions, Eastern and Western, contained fragments of an original wisdom. That Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, and indigenous traditions were all imperfect expressions of universal truths. This idea that you could pick and choose from different traditions, that all paths led to the same summit, that spiritual truth transcended any single religion, this was revolutionary. It's so familiar to us now that we forget how radical it was in the 1880s. The idea that a Christian might meditate like a Buddhist, or a Hindu might appreciate Jesus' teachings, or that someone might create their own spiritual practice combining elements from multiple traditions. This was almost unthinkable before Theosophy. Blavatsky didn't just introduce Eastern ideas to the West. She created the permission structure for Westerners to adopt them without converting to Eastern religions. And in doing so, she invented what we now call New Age spirituality, or being spiritual but not religious. Here are concepts that either didn't exist in Western culture before Blavatsky or existed only in obscure academic contexts. Karma and reincarnation. These were Hindu and Buddhist concepts, but Blavatsky repackaged them for Western consumption. She stripped away the religious context and presented them as natural laws, spiritual physics. Your actions in this life determine your circumstances in the next. You've lived many lives and will live many more, evolving spiritually with each incarnation. Ascended Masters. The idea that highly evolved beings exist who guide humanity's spiritual evolution, that they're not gods but humans who've achieved enlightenment and now work behind the scenes. This concept directly leads to modern channeling, the New Age obsession with angels and guides, and even some UFO beliefs, ancient astronauts as enlightened beings, root races, and spiritual evolution. Blavatsky's most problematic legacy. She taught that humanity evolves through distinct races, each more spiritually advanced than the last. This was later twisted by racists, including Nazis, to justify horrific ideologies. But it also introduced the idea that humanity is evolving spiritually, moving toward higher consciousness, an idea central to New Age thought Atlantis and Lemuria. Blavatsky popularized these lost continents as real places where advanced civilizations existed. Now, every New Age bookstore has a section on Atlantis. Every documentary about ancient mysteries references it. It's become a permanent part of alternative history, and it all traces back to the secret doctrine. The 7 principles, bodies. The idea that humans aren't just physical bodies, but have multiple subtle bodies, etheric, astral, mental, spiritual. This framework underlies chakra work, aura reading, and most energy healing practices. The Aquarian Age. The belief that humanity is transitioning into a new age of enlightenment and spiritual awareness. This comes from Blavatsky's synthesis of Hindu concepts of yugas, cosmic ages, with Western astrology. Every single one of these concepts, now so common in spiritual circles that people don't even question them, was either invented or popularized by Helena Blavatsky. Blavatsky's influence extended far beyond people who explicitly identified as Theosophists. Rudolf Steiner started as a Theosophist before breaking away to found Anthroposophy. His Waldorf schools and biodynamic farming are theosophical concepts adapted and rebranded. Alice Bailey took Blavatsky's teachings about the masters and developed them into a vast cosmology of their own. Bailey's work directly influenced the New Age movement of the 1960s to 70s. Jiddu Krishnamurti was discovered as a child by Theosophists in India and groomed to be the world teacher, the next Buddha. He eventually rejected this role, but remained influential in spiritual circles, teaching meditation and self-inquiry. Carl Jung was deeply influenced by theosophical ideas about consciousness, the collective unconscious, and spiritual archetypes. He never acknowledged the debt, but it's obvious in his work. Aldous Huxley drew heavily on theosophical concepts in The Perennial Philosophy and his exploration of consciousness. The Beat Generation, particularly Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, encountered Buddhism through theosophical interpretations before more authentic Buddhist teachers arrived in America. The 1960s counterculture, with its syncretism, its Eastern-influenced spirituality, its belief in consciousness evolution, all of this has theosophical DNA. Modern yoga in the West is heavily filtered through theosophical interpretations. Blavatsky and her followers positioned yoga not as Hindu religious practice, but as universal spiritual technology. Even positive thinking and manifestation culture, The Secret, Law of Attraction, vision boards, these draw from theosophical ideas about thought as creative force, about consciousness shaping reality. If you've ever talked about your chakras, referred to your higher self, described yourself as spiritual but not religious, believed in past lives, thought humanity is evolving toward higher consciousness, referenced ancient wisdom, seen a connection between quantum physics and spirituality, believed that different religions teach the same truth, then you're thinking thoughts that Helena Blavatsky shaped, whether you know her name or not. All of this came at enormous personal cost to Blavatsky herself. After the Hodgson report, she couldn't return to India. The scandal had made her position there untenable. She settled in London, living in a house provided by wealthy theosophists. Her health was terrible. She'd always been large, but now she was suffering from Bright's disease, kidney disease, heart problems, and complications from years of smoking. She was increasingly immobile, often bedridden. She was in constant pain, relied on morphine to manage it, knew she was dying, but she kept working, kept writing, kept teaching the devoted students who came to her, kept producing the secret doctrine, working from her bed when she was too weak to sit at a desk. The Theosophical Society had split into factions arguing over her legacy, over whether the phenomena had been real, over what her teachings actually meant. This caused her immense distress. And through it all, she never admitted fraud, never recanted, maintained until her death that she had been a genuine student of the Masters, that the phenomena had been real, that her teachings came from ancient wisdom, not her own invention. Was she delusional? Had she convinced herself that her inventions were revelations? Or was she maintaining the lie to the end? We'll never know, but the cost, physically, emotionally, of sustaining that position was crushing. In 1891, her kidneys finally failed completely. She developed influenza, which her weakened body couldn't fight. On May 8, 1891, in London, surrounded by devoted students, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky died. She was 59 years old, though she looked much older. Her body was cremated, a Hindu practice, one final gesture toward the Eastern traditions she'd spent her life promoting in the West. Her last reported words were, "Keep the link unbroken. Do not let my last incarnation be a failure." The link wasn't broken. The Theosophical Society continued, and continues still. But more importantly, the ideas she'd planted continued to grow, mutate, spread through Western culture, until they became part of the air we breathe. Whether she was prophet or fraud, genius or charlatan, Helena Blavatsky changed the world. Let's be honest about the evidence. The Hodgson report was thorough. The hidden panels in the Adyar shrine were real. The Coulombe's testimony was detailed and specific. The handwriting analysis showing similarity between Blavatsky's writing and the Mahatma letters was convincing. Blavatsky had motive and opportunity for fraud. She needed to establish authority in spiritualist circles. She needed to fund her lifestyle and her society. She needed to convince followers that her teachings came from genuine sources of ancient wisdom, not just her own imagination. And we know she lied about parts of her past. The Tibetan travels are almost certainly fabricated. The claims about studying in hidden monasteries can't be verified. The stanzas of Jian don't exist in any known archive. If you constructed a courtroom case based on evidence, the verdict would be clear. Helena Blavatsky was a fraud. A talented, brilliant, influential fraud, but a fraud nonetheless. She learned stage magic techniques during her travels. She used them to produce phenomena that amazed witnesses who didn't understand how such tricks worked. She manipulated devoted followers who wanted desperately to believe, and she built a religious movement on a foundation of deception. Case closed, right? Except, it's not quite that simple. First, not all the phenomena can be easily explained away. Some manifestations happened when Blavatsky was being closely watched by skeptical observers who were specifically looking for tricks. Some occurred in situations where the usual explanations, hidden assistance, mechanical devices, sleight of hand, don't quite fit. A.P. Sinnett, a newspaper editor and devoted theosophist who knew Blavatsky well, described incidents where objects appeared in contexts that seemed to rule out normal deception. Letters materialized in places Blavatsky couldn't have accessed. Sounds occurred when she was demonstrably elsewhere. Now, Sinnett was a believer, so his testimony is suspect. But he was also an intelligent, educated man who'd started as a skeptic. His descriptions are detailed and specific. Second, the breadth of Blavatsky's knowledge is genuinely impressive, even mysterious. She had almost no formal education. She had never attended university. Much of her childhood was spent in remote Russian estates. Yet, she demonstrated knowledge of Sanskrit terms, Tibetan concepts, obscure Hermetic traditions, and Eastern philosophies that were barely translated into European languages. Yes, she had access to libraries. Yes, she was brilliant at synthesizing information. But some scholars who've studied her work closely admit bewilderment at how she knew certain things, references that don't appear in any texts available to her at the time. One example. She described concepts from Tibetan Buddhism that weren't translated into English until decades after The Secret Doctrine was published. How did she know about them? Possible explanation. She encountered Tibetan monks in her travels, and they taught her. But we have no evidence she actually traveled to Tibet. Alternative explanation. She accessed genuine, intuitive knowledge, channeling information from somewhere. Third, there's the question of consistency. Blavatsky's cosmology in The Secret Doctrine is incredibly detailed and internally consistent. Across 1,500 pages, across multiple writings spanning years, she maintains a coherent system. That's difficult to fake. Most fraudulent channelers contradict themselves, forget details, have inconsistencies in their revelations. Blavatsky's system holds together remarkably well. This could mean she was a systematic fraud, someone who carefully tracked her inventions to avoid contradictions. Or it could mean she was accessing something genuine, some unified vision that maintained consistency because it was real in some sense. But there's a third possibility that's more interesting and perhaps more accurate than either complete fraud or genuine mystic. Maybe Helena Blavatsky was both simultaneously. Consider the possibility that she had genuine mystical experiences, visions, intuitions, moments of expanded consciousness, but also knew that these private experiences wouldn't convince others. So she staged phenomena to prove what she genuinely experienced. Or consider that she started with genuine abilities, perhaps some form of psychic sensitivity, unusual perceptive powers. But as those abilities faded or proved unreliable, she began faking to maintain her position. Or consider that she was psychologically fractured in an interesting way, able to access unusual states of consciousness, genuinely channeling something from her own deep unconscious that felt like external masters, while also consciously manipulating her followers. This third option suggests someone much more complex than either charlatan or saint. Someone who was sincerely religious while also being deliberately deceptive. Someone who believed her own mythology while also constructing it. This is psychologically uncomfortable. We want people to be consistently one thing or another, heroes or villains, prophets or frauds. But humans are rarely that simple. And the most interesting figures in religious history, the ones who actually change things, are often precisely this kind of complicated. Here's an uncomfortable question. How different is Blavatsky from other religious founders? Joseph Smith, founder of Mormonism, claimed to translate ancient golden plates that no one else could see and that conveniently disappeared after translation. Is that fundamentally different from Blavatsky's stanzas of Dhyan? Muhammad claimed to receive revelations from Allah through the angel Gabriel. No one else witnessed these revelations. We take them on faith because they produced the Quran and inspired millions. How is that different from Blavatsky claiming to receive teachings from Mahatmas that produced the secret doctrine and inspired millions? St. Paul had a vision on the road to Damascus that completely changed the direction of Christianity. No one else saw what he saw. We accept it because of its fruits, the spread of Christianity through the Roman world. The Buddha's enlightenment under the Bodhi tree was a private experience. We believe it happened because of the teaching tradition that followed. In every case, we're assessing religious founders not by whether we can prove their experiences were objectively real, but by the quality and impact of what they produced. By that standard, Blavatsky is a genuine religious founder. She created a system of thought that has influenced millions. She changed how people think about spirituality. She opened doorways that remain open. Does it matter if the Mahatmas were real external beings or products of her own creative unconscious? The teachings exist either way. The impact is the same either way. We should also consider how gender shaped both Blavatsky's life and how she's remembered. In the 19th century, a woman claiming religious authority was radical and dangerous. The acceptable roles for women in spirituality were limited: nuns under male religious authority, or mediums, passive vessels for spirits to speak through. Blavatsky refused both roles. She claimed active authority. She created doctrine, not just channeled messages. She positioned herself as a teacher, not a vessel. To make this acceptable, she had to frame herself as a messenger for male masters. Even then, she was constantly attacked in ways male religious teachers weren't. Her appearance was mocked. Her sexuality was questioned. Her mental health was constantly suspect in ways that male mystics wasn't. The Hodgson report, while claiming objectivity, drips with gendered contempt. Hodgson describes her as accomplished, ingenious, and interesting imposter. Note the feminized diminishment. Male charlatans of the era were dangerous frauds. Blavatsky was an amusing curiosity. Would a male religious founder making the same claims have been taken more seriously? Would his phenomena have been investigated with slightly more willingness to believe? We can't know. But the double standard is worth noting. Blavatsky deliberately cultivated an unfeminine appearance, the weight, the smoking, the crude language, perhaps as a way of claiming authority that beauty and conventional femininity would have denied her. She made herself impossible to dismiss as just another pretty medium. And it worked. She created a movement. She exercised genuine religious authority. She left a legacy. But the cost was that she's remembered more as a curiosity than as a serious, religious thinker. The fraud accusations stick to her in ways they don't to male founders of similar movements. Here's what we know for sure. Helena Blavatsky created a synthesis of Eastern and Western spiritual thought that was unprecedented in its scope and influence. She brought concepts like karma, reincarnation, meditation, and yoga into Western consciousness in forms that made them accessible and appealing. She challenged both Christian religious monopoly and materialist scientific monopoly, offering a third option that synthesized spirit and matter. She gave permission for people to construct their own spiritual paths, drawing from multiple traditions. She inspired multiple generations of seekers, teachers, and movements that continue to this day. Whether she did this through genuine contact with Tibetan masters, through brilliant creative synthesis of existing sources, or through some combination of mystical experience and deliberate invention, the result is the same. She changed the spiritual landscape of the Western world. Helena Blavatsky's body was cremated on May 11th, 1891, at Woking Crematorium in England. Cremation was still unusual in Victorian England, controversial even, as it seemed un-Christian. But for a woman who'd spent her life promoting Eastern spiritual practices, who'd written extensively about reincarnation, who'd positioned herself as a bridge between East and West, cremation was the obvious choice. Her ashes were divided into 3 parts. One portion remained in London with the European Theosophists. One portion was sent to New York for American members. One portion was sent to India, to Adyar, to the headquarters she'd established and then been forced to leave. Even in death, she was fragmented, distributed, existing in multiple places at once. The Theosophical Society held memorial services in multiple countries simultaneously. Thousands of members participated, treating her death not as an ending, but as a transition, another incarnation, another step in her spiritual evolution. They celebrated her life, her teachings, her courage, her vision, and they largely ignored or dismissed the fraud allegations. For true believers, the Hodgson report was persecution, not proof. The Coulombs were vindictive liars. The hidden panels in the shrine were either later additions or misunderstood tools for genuine phenomena. Belief is powerful. Once people have invested emotionally in a teaching, in a community, in a worldview, evidence against it rarely changes minds. It's dismissed, reinterpreted, or ignored. This isn't unique to Theosophy. It's how humans work. It's how all religious movements survive their founders' controversies. After Blavatsky's death, the Theosophical Society initially thrived. Annie Besant, a brilliant British socialist and women's rights activist, took over leadership and proved to be a more effective administrator than Blavatsky had been. The society grew, became more organized, spread to more countries, but it also fractured. Different factions interpreted Blavatsky's teachings differently. Some emphasized the occult practices, others the philosophical teachings, others the social reform aspects. Rudolf Steiner broke away to found Anthroposophy, taking many European theosophists with him. Alice Bailey created a rival organization based on her own channeled teachings from the masters. Other splinter groups formed, each claiming to represent the true continuation of Blavatsky's work. This is typical of religious movements after their founder's death. Without the central authoritative figure, interpretations multiply. But all these splinter groups, even when they rejected the name Theosophy, continue to spread Blavatsky's core ideas: spiritual evolution, hidden masters, ancient wisdom, the synthesis of science and spirituality, the idea that all religions contain truth. The seeds she'd planted kept growing, even in gardens she'd never intended. By the 1960s, Theosophy as an organized movement had faded from cultural prominence. The society still exists today, but it was no longer at the center of spiritual innovation, but its ideas had become ubiquitous. The 1960s counterculture's embrace of Eastern spirituality. That path was cleared by Theosophy. The Beatles going to India to study with the Maharishi. Unthinkable, without decades of theosophical preparation of Western audiences to take Eastern teachers seriously. The Human Potential Movement, Est, New Age spirituality, all drew heavily from theosophical concepts, often without acknowledging the source. Blavatsky's ideas had become so pervasive that people didn't even realize they were someone's ideas. They seemed like timeless wisdom. Yoga studios across America and Europe teaching that yoga is universal spiritual practice rather than Hindu religious practice. That's a theosophical interpretation. Meditation presented as a mental health technique rather than Buddhist religious practice. Theosophical framing, the entire vocabulary of personal transformation, higher consciousness, spiritual evolution, finding your true self. Blavatsky's language, now so common we don't even notice it. Walk into any metaphysical bookstore. Look at the sections. Chakras and energy, healing past lives and reincarnation, Atlantis and ancient mysteries, channeling and spirit guides, quantum mysticism. Every single section owes its existence to concepts Blavatsky popularized or invented. But we have to acknowledge the dangerous aspects of Blavatsky's legacy too. Her teachings about root races, the idea that humanity evolves through distinct racial groups, with Aryans being the current and most spiritually advanced race, were poisonous. She claimed these were spiritual races, not biological ones. She insisted she wasn't promoting racial superiority, but the language she used, positioning Aryans as more evolved than other races, was easily weaponized. Nazi occultists drew heavily from Theosophy. They twisted her teachings into justification for genocide, claiming they were advancing spiritual evolution by eliminating inferior races. Blavatsky would have been horrified. Her actual views were more complex, and she explicitly opposed racial prejudice. But she created a framework that could be misused, and it was this is the danger of esoteric teachings about hidden hierarchies and spiritual evolution. They can too easily become justifications for earthly hierarchies and real-world oppression. Modern Theosophy has largely abandoned the root race teachings, recognizing how toxic they were. But that damage was done and can't be undone. So what do we make of Helena Blavatsky? A fraud who accidentally created something meaningful, a genuine mystic whose methods were questionable, a brilliant religious innovator who used myth and deception as teaching tools. The evidence suggests she was consciously fraudulent in at least some of her phenomena. The Hodgson report's findings are too specific, too well documented to dismiss entirely, but the evidence also suggests she had genuine mystical experiences, genuine insights, genuine access to unusual states of consciousness. Too many elements of her work, the consistency, the depth, the knowledge of obscure sources, suggests something more than simple fraud. Perhaps the most accurate description is this: she was a creative religious genius who used stage magic to dramatize genuine spiritual insights. She was both prophet and con artist, mystic and manipulator, visionary and fraud. And maybe that combination is necessary for religious innovation. Maybe all religious founders operate in this ambiguous space between genuine experience and deliberate construction. Maybe the line between revelation and invention is always blurrier than we want to admit. Ultimately, the question, was Blavatsky a fraud, is less interesting than the question, what did she accomplish? And the answer to that second question is staggering. She almost single-handedly brought Eastern spiritual concepts into Western consciousness. Yes, there were other translators and scholars and teachers, but Blavatsky made these concepts accessible, appealing, and applicable to ordinary Western lives. She created permission for people to construct their own spirituality. Before Theosophy, you were basically stuck with the religion you were born into, or you abandoned religion entirely. Blavatsky offered a third option: synthesize, pick and choose. Create your own path. This is so normal to us now that we forget how radical it was. The entire spiritual but not religious phenomenon, now the fastest growing religious category in America, is Blavatsky's legacy. She challenged the dichotomy between science and religion. While conventional Christianity was retreating in the face of scientific advancement, Blavatsky argued for a spiritual science. She claimed that mystical truths and scientific truths were compatible, that spirituality could be investigated, that consciousness was a natural phenomenon worth studying. Modern neuroscience research on meditation, psychology's interest in spirituality, the whole field of consciousness studies. These exist in part because Blavatsky insisted that spiritual experiences weren't just subjective feelings, but real phenomena worth serious investigation. She gave women authority in spirituality. She claimed and exercised religious leadership in an era when that was nearly impossible for women. She inspired generations of women to become spiritual teachers, writers, leaders. Annie Besant, Alice Bailey, and many others followed the path she'd opened. And she created a genuinely new religious mythology. She didn't just repackage Christianity or import Eastern religions wholesale. She synthesized, innovated, invented. She created Atlantis as spiritual history, root races as evolutionary framework, Mahatmas as teaching device, the secret doctrine as cosmology. Whether these came from genuine revelation or brilliant imagination almost doesn't matter. They functioned as mythology, and good mythology doesn't need to be literally true to be functionally true. On her deathbed, surrounded by devoted students, Blavatsky reportedly said, "Keep the link unbroken. Do not let my last incarnation be a failure." That statement is quintessentially Blavatsky: dramatic, ego-driven, spiritually ambitious, and oddly humble all at once. My last incarnation. She believed she would reincarnate, continue her work in another body, another life, or claim to believe it. Or couldn't distinguish between belief and claim. A failure. By what standard? If we judge by whether her phenomena were genuine, then yes, probably a failure. The fraud evidence is too strong. But if we judge by impact, by influence, by the number of lives changed and perspectives shifted, and new possibilities opened, then Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was one of the most successful religious innovators in modern history. The link wasn't broken. Far from it. Every time someone talks about finding their higher self, they're speaking Blavatsky's language. Every time someone references past lives or karma or spiritual evolution, they're using her concepts. Every time someone creates a personal spiritual practice, drawing from multiple traditions, they're following her model. She's so deeply embedded in Western spiritual culture that she's become invisible. The water we swim in, a fraud who told truths, a charlatan who changed the world, a woman who invented herself, invented her past, invented a religion, and made all of it real through sheer force of will and brilliance. That's the mystery of Madame Blavatsky. And like all good mysteries, it has no definitive solution, only an invitation to wonder. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's strangest and most influential lives. If you found value in this exploration, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Archives. Your support allows us to continue illuminating the forgotten corners of history. And let me know in the comments, have you encountered Blavatsky's ideas without knowing their source? This has been the story of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the woman who invented modern mysticism, the fraud who revealed truths, the charlatan who changed how millions of people understand spirituality. Whether prophet or imposter, she remains impossible to ignore. Till next time, this has been the Midnight Archives.